Hi Puzzles and Pieces, this is Jessica from MultiplicityAndMe, giving you the lived experience of DID. Apologies for the long pause between videos. We've been adjusting to a brand new work routine, so it's taking us a little while to get used to stuff. But we finally feel like we're in the swing of things, which is fabulous. I wanted to bring a really quick overview of DID myths versus facts because I felt this was just so well overdue. The papers I'll be mainly focusing on today are by two of the leading experts basically in trauma and dissociation. So they are Professor Bethany Brand and Dr. Lowenstein. Of course, with any of our cited videos, you can find the links to these papers in the description below, so please do check them out for some further research. So you can double check what I'm saying to you and making sure that these facts are not coming out of thin air. But before we dive in, let's get the importance of ending the stigma out of the way first. Professor Brand says, clinicians who accept myths as facts are unlikely to carefully assess for dissociation. Accurate diagnoses are critical for appropriate treatment planning. If DID is not targeted in treatment, it does not appear to resolve. The myths we have highlighted may also impede research about DID. The cost of ignorance about DID is high not only for individual patients, but for the whole support system in which they reside. Empirically derived knowledge about DID has replaced outdated myths. Quick water break because I'm going to talk a lot in this video today, so apologies in advance. So I think first of all what we need is a clear definition of DID, which is beautifully summarised by Professor Brand. Dissociative identity disorder is defined in the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5, as an identity disruption indicated by the presence of two or more distinct personality states experienced as possession in some cultures, with discontinuity in sense of self and agency, and with variations in affect, behaviour, consciousness, memory, perception, cognition, or sensory motor functioning. Individuals with DID experience recurrent gaps in autobiographical memory. The signs and the symptoms of DID may be observed by others and reported by the individual. DSM-5 stipulates that symptoms cause significant distress and are not attributable to accepted cultural or religious practices. DID is a complex post-traumatic developmental disorder. DSM-5 specifically locates the Dissociative Disorders chapter after the chapter on trauma and stressor-related disorders, thereby acknowledging the relationship of dissociative disorders to psychological trauma. Okay, so looking at our very first myth, what's it going to be? So DID and OSDD are a modern phenomenon. False. The first published cases are of Jean Ferry, I think I pronounced that right, Jean Ferry, reported in 1586. So this isn't yesterday. And a case of exchanged personality dates back to 1791. And by the 19th century, debate was had on the label of diagnostics, so whether or not something like this would be classified as a dual consciousness, which would be now dissociation, somnambulism, which is like the hypnotic states, or hysteria, which is classed now as a lot of the somatoform disorders. They eventually decided on somatoform hysteria as a coverall to basically describe trauma and dissociation. That changed, however, by World War I, when shell shock was first described, fitting much of the criteria laid out by somatoform hysteria. Professionals who originally labelled these symptoms as exotic and bizarre came into question. And of course, this shell shock later became known as post-traumatic stress. The effects of childhood trauma were also starting to be taken seriously, and it took until 1980s for PTSD to be recognised in the diagnostic manual as a separate mental health condition. Many of the individuals considered hysterics in the 19th century would today be diagnosed with dissociative disorders. That's a fact. And that's mainly from Lowenstein's description, but even Brand adds here, early debates focused whether or not hysteria should be conceptualized as a somatoform condition, a condition of altered states of consciousness, or a condition rooted entirely in suggestion. Second fact, DID is extremely rare. So be careful when you're researching into this. I always encourage you guys to do, additional readings and look into things yourselves. It's important for us to stay critically minded. But lots of studies seem to look into specific populations. So there's one about college students, there's one about inpatient units, there's lots of different things like that, but very few are on, I guess, more generalized population. Generally what we can say is DID may be a minimum population of 1%. We could probably liken the commonality of having DID to having schizophrenia, which is around about the same remit. When you're looking at more specific populations like inpatient units, that tends to be obviously a lot higher. Interestingly, depersonalization and derealization disorders, which are also part of the dissociative spectrum, may be as high as 2.5%. And from the studies cited by the paper, it appears that OSDD is more common than DID. So hence why I think you see this figure about 1 to 3% flying about, because it would kind of be, an encompass all for all those different types of dissociative disorders, not just DID. Further breaking it down, it's concluded by Brand that DID is more under-recognised and underdiagnosed than it is overdiagnosed. And this is primarily due to lack of training, coupled with ignorance and just overall disbelief of the condition. Hence why breaking down these myths versus facts and encouraging people to learn about them is so incredibly important. Another statement I often hear is DID always has to be very obvious and overt. False. As we always repeat on this channel, we are certainly a minority, not a majority. DID symptoms are generally subtle and covert. Lowenstein states, the elaboration of the fascinating external characteristics of the states with varying names, wardrobes, hairstyles, accents, etc. is not essential to DID diagnosis or core phenomenology, which coincides to another one that switching is obvious, which is another false statement. Those with DID typically manifest as inner voices or through symptoms of passive influence, not florid switching behaviour. Typically, state switching may be relatively uncommon in DID, with states more typically subtly shifting, consistent with better functioning, which makes sense. DID is a fad. Although, of course, we will make exceptions that factitious disorders masking specifically DID are of course going to exist. DID as a whole cannot be currently supported by the current body of research as a fad. There's just far too much out there that contradicts all of that. Bethany Brand's words, not mine, but I am certainly in agreement. Some notable points from Professor Brand concerning this are: DID patients can be reliably and validly diagnosed with structured and semi-structured interviews. And it can also be diagnosed in clinical settings where structured interviews may not be available or practical to use. DID patients are consistently identified in outpatient, inpatient and community samples around the world. DID patients can be differentiated from other psychiatric patients, healthy controls and DID simulators in neurophysiological and psychological research. DID patients usually benefit from psychotherapy that addresses trauma and dissociation in accordance with expert consensus guidelines. So that again is kind of contradicting the point that DID itself is made up, it's a fad, it's from Hollywood. It's not, because plenty of evidence of research exists out there. DID is fantasy-based or iatrogenic. Brand states straight away against this. Despite the concerns of fantasy model theorists that DID is iatrogenically created, that is, the suggestion that it's implanted as fact by the therapist, no study in any clinical population supports the fantasy model of dissociation, and she's chosen to highlight this in italics at this point. A single study conducted in a normal sample of college students showed that students could simulate DID. That study by Spanos and colleagues documents that students can engage in identity enactments when asked to behave as if they have DID. Nevertheless, the students did not actually begin to believe that they had DID, and they did not develop the wide range of severe, chronic and disabling symptoms displayed by DID patients. Studies have also been concluded in China and Turkey, where the condition is much less known in popular media and even much less recognised medically, and the prevalence rates are around the same, as there is no biological evidence that DID exists, which is false. A fantastic paper by Professor Reinders and colleagues published in 2019 shows how brain biomarkers for DID actually exist. It's quite an in-depth paper. So Simone and colleagues state that we propose a pattern of neuroimaging biomarkers that could be used to inform the identification of individuals with DID from healthy controls at the individual level. Essentially, you can recognise somebody under a brain scanner with DID in comparison to someone without. This is important and clinically relevant because the DID diagnosis is so controversial and individuals with DID are often misdiagnosed. Ultimately, the application of pattern recognition methodologies could prevent unnecessary suffering of individuals with DID because of an earlier accurate diagnosis, which will facilitate faster and targeted interventions. What that's saying is, if you can literally see that someone has DID just putting them through a brain scanner, then you can evidence that straight away and that person can get the right help, which is so important. The pattern classifiers were able to accurately discriminate between individuals with DID and healthy controls with high sensitivity at 72% and specificity at 74% on the basis of brain structure. These findings provide evidence for a biological basis for distinguishing between DID affected and healthy individuals. We therefore propose that future research into dissociation and DID focuses on these specific prefrontal areas, as well as the middle and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And that last part in particular really fascinates me because I remember that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is essentially the timekeeper of the brain. So it would make sense that if you were experiencing some form of dissociation, something would be different within the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So that really does make sense in my very limited understanding of neuropsychology's eyes. They finalise then by stating, applying pattern recognition methods to brain imaging data of people with DID offers a biomarker approach that can complement, aid and improve clinical decision making. This could reduce misdiagnoses, treatment time, treatment costs, and ultimately improve the patient's quality of life, which is what we're here for, guys, right? We're raising the understanding, we're tackling the stigma, and we're creating more education for both as a personal and a professional level in hopes to help us understand further about what we're experiencing, and from a professional perspective or a loved one's perspective, about understanding what that person may be going through and recognizing those important signs and symptoms. And that's why understanding the myths versus facts and ending that stigma on this disorder are so incredibly important. And that's another puzzle piece together. Good job, you guys, on becoming more educated. Woo! We hope that this video can be used to tackle some of those misconceptions out there. And again, all papers used to give this data today can be read in further details in the links below. So please do go ahead and check them out. As always, we encourage anyone everywhere to do their own reading and make their own conclusions, as it's always important to remain critically minded. And as always, please, please, please make sure that you do speak to a relevant professional if you feel that you may need support. And remember, whether or not you have DID, just remember that each part of you deserves self-love, self-care and compassion. And thank you guys ever so much today for becoming more educated, and we really appreciate you guys being here and helping us tackle the stigma of DID. Okay, thanks everyone, bye! Also really want to shout out to our small business supporter today of Powerful Paws. So I will link them in the description below. They were ever so kind just to approach us and say, hey, would you like to try some bits for Fable, our amazingly fluffy Shetland sheepdog? And so they sent us 2 bags of lovely, lovely treats, and oh my gosh, the one is gone. We're on to the second bag now. As well as, look at these cutest little bibbies in the world. Look, a little bumblebee bib and a lead here, and then we've got the same with a rainbow collar and bib and lead as well. And Fable has been loving his walks with those on. So thank you ever so much. And thank you ever so much to Powerful Paws for that, because absolutely, walking your dogs, getting outside, getting out and about does increase well-being. So thank you for letting us share your wonderful business online. And thank you so much for the freebies. It's ever so kind and we didn't expect it. Thank you. If you know of a small business that would like a little bit more promotion about the work that they do around well-being, please feel free to drop us an email at multiplicityandme@gmail.com. And as well as giving Powerful Paws a follow, don't forget that you can follow us too on different social media. So that's Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, as well as, of course, YouTube and Patreon. So please feel free to check us out on any and all platforms that you fancy.